when my own father looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're nothing but a broke loser." I just stood there, watching him high-five my brother across our family's mahogany dining table. They clinked champagne glasses while my mother sighed dramatically, wondering aloud where they went wrong with me. 3 months later, their jaws hit the floor when my bank statement, showing $80 million, accidentally slipped out of my bag at the family reunion. But that's jumping ahead. Let me start from the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I grew up in the shadow of success. The Wyatt family name meant something in our town. It meant money, influence, and power. My father, Richard Wyatt, built his real estate empire from scratch, or at least, that's the story he told at every dinner party, charity gala, and family gathering. My older brother, Ethan, followed perfectly in his footsteps, captain of the lacrosse team, Ivy League business school, and then straight into the family business where he quickly became the golden child. And then there was me, Olivia, the creative one, the dreamer, the disappointment. From my earliest memories, I knew I was different. While my father and brother talked property values and investment portfolios over breakfast, I'd be sketching designs for eco-friendly tiny homes in my notebook. When they celebrated closing multi-million-dollar deals, I'd be volunteering at the local shelter, teaching financial literacy to people who'd fallen on hard times. "Your sister thinks she can save the world instead of making money," my father would joke to Ethan, but the laughter always carried an edge that cut deep. "Good thing we have you to take over the business someday." I still remember the day I graduated with my degree in sustainable urban development. My thesis on affordable housing solutions had won a national award. The ceremony was on a perfect spring day, sunshine streaming through the trees as we sat in our caps and gowns. I scanned the crowd repeatedly, hoping to see their faces. My row was called. I walked across the stage, accepted my diploma, and moved the tassel on my cap from right to left. No applause came from my family. They weren't there. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Sorry we missed it, honey. Your father had an important client meeting, and Ethan had to be there to learn the ropes. We'll celebrate when you're home." But when I returned, there was no celebration. Just a small envelope with a check for $1,000 and a note that read, "Time to join the real world now." The real world, according to Richard Wyatt, meant joining Wyatt Development Group, taking an entry-level position and working my way up through good old-fashioned hard work, just like he claimed he had, conveniently omitting the $2 million loan from his own father that started it all. Instead, I took my $1,000, rented a tiny studio apartment across town, and started looking for work with nonprofits focused on sustainable housing. My father's response was immediate and cold. "You're throwing your life away," he said over the phone, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Do you know how many people would kill for the opportunity I'm offering you?" "I know, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I need to build something of my own." His laugh was harsh. "Build what? A career begging for donations? You'll be broke your entire life." Those words echoed in my head for months as I struggled to find my footing. I sent out dozens of applications each week. Had interviews that went nowhere. My savings dwindled while my student loans loomed. Every family dinner became an exercise in humiliation. "How's the job hunt going?" my mother would ask, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Still looking for the right fit," I'd say, trying to maintain my dignity. "The right fit," my father would echo mockingly. Meanwhile, Ethan just closed the Henderson deal, 7 figures. The pride in his voice when he talked about my brother was a stark contrast to the disappointment when he addressed me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 6 months after graduation, I hit rock bottom. My apartment building was being converted to luxury condos, meaning my already steep rent would double. My car needed repairs I couldn't afford. And I was down to eating ramen noodles for most meals. I sat on my lumpy futon, staring at my phone, knowing I should call my father and admit defeat. I could almost hear his voice. "I told you so." Then my phone rang. An unknown number. "Is this Olivia Wyatt?" a woman's voice asked when I answered. Yes, speaking. This is Elena Mirova from Urban Renewal Partners. We received your application and were very impressed with your thesis work on microhousing solutions. We'd like to bring you in for an interview. My heart pounded. Urban Renewal Partners was a small but innovative firm working on sustainable development projects around the country. I'd applied months ago but assumed they'd passed on me like everyone else. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend preparing, researching their projects, and formulating ideas I could bring to the table. By Tuesday morning, I was equal parts nervous and excited, dressed in my only professional outfit, a navy blue blazer and skirt I'd found at a thrift store. Elena Mirova turned out to be a formidable woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and piercing eyes that seemed to evaluate my every word. But she listened intently as I outlined my vision for community-focused housing projects. Your approach is refreshing, Ms. Wyatt, she said when I finished. Most candidates come in talking about profits and market share. You're talking about community impact and sustainability. I believe we can have both, I replied. Ethical development can be profitable. She smiled for the first time. That's exactly our philosophy. She slid a folder across the desk. This is a new project we're considering. An eco-village concept outside Portland. We need someone to lead community engagement and sustainable design integration. The position is yours if you want it. I opened the folder, glanced at the project details, and then at the compensation package. The salary was modest but fair, with profit-sharing options if the project succeeded. When can you start? Elena asked. Immediately, I said, without hesitation. That night, I called my parents to share the news. My mother answered. That's nice, dear, she said distractedly after I excitedly explained the opportunity. Oh, your father wants to speak with you. I heard the phone change hands. Urban what? My father barked. Never heard of them. What's the salary? I told him and he laughed. That's less than what we pay our receptionists. This is what your fancy degree got you? Ethan made more than that in bonuses last month alone. The comparison to Ethan, as always, was like a knife to the heart. But something had changed in me. I didn't feel the usual shame. I'm not Ethan, Dad. And this is just the beginning. The beginning of what? A lifetime of financial struggle? Wake up, Olivia. You're making a mistake. I took a deep breath. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. There was a long pause. Don't come running to us when this little adventure fails, he said finally, and hung up. I moved to Portland the following week. The work was challenging but fulfilling. Elena became not just my boss but a mentor. Under her guidance, I learned to navigate zoning laws, negotiate with contractors, and engage with community stakeholders. Our eco-village project gained traction, drawing attention from sustainable living advocates and environmental groups. 6 months into the job, Elena called me into her office. We've been approached by an investor, she said, sliding a business card across the desk. Thomas Laurent. He's interested in our model and wants to talk expansion. The meeting with Thomas changed everything. He wasn't the typical investor in pressed suits and slick presentations. He arrived in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a quiet, thoughtful manner that put everyone at ease. I've been following your Portland project, he told us over coffee. Your approach to community integration is exactly what I've been looking for. Thomas explained that he had inherited a vast fortune from his grandfather, who had made billions in tech. But unlike many heirs, Thomas was determined to use his wealth to drive positive change. I want to scale what you're doing, he said. Not just in Portland, but nationwide. Maybe even globally. Sustainable communities that people can actually afford to live in. Are you interested? The partnership began with a $10 million investment into Urban Renewal Partners, with me leading the expansion team. Over the next 2 years, we launched projects in 5 different states, each one more successful than the last. I worked 18-hour days, pouring everything I had into making these communities thrive. As our success grew, so did my personal investment portfolio. Thomas had insisted that all key team members receive equity in each project. I believe in shared prosperity, he'd explained. When the projects succeed, everyone who contributed should benefit. 3 years after that interview with Elena, I was sitting in my office, now the headquarters of Wyatt Community Development, my own spin-off company focusing specifically on affordable eco-housing, when my assistant knocked on the door. "Your brother's here to see you," she said, looking confused. I hadn't spoken to Ethan in over a year. He walked in, looking exactly like the successful executive he was, in his tailored suit and polished shoes. But there was something different in his expression. Uncertainty, maybe even respect. "Nice place," he said, glancing around my office with its large windows overlooking the city. "Dad doesn't know I'm here. Why are you here, Ethan?" He sat down across from me. "The Henderson project is falling apart. We can't get community buy-in, environmental groups are protesting, and the city council is stalling on permits." The Henderson project was my father's latest luxury development, a gated community of multi-million-dollar homes that would displace a historic neighborhood. "That's unfortunate," I said carefully. "I've been following your work," Ethan continued, "the press you've been getting, the awards. Your Portland model is being taught in business schools now, did you know that?" I hadn't known. "I need your help, Liv," he said, using my childhood nickname for the first time in years. "Can you consult on Henderson? Help us fix this?" I was stunned. My brother, my father's golden child, was asking for my help. The irony wasn't lost on me. "What does Dad say about this?" Ethan looked uncomfortable. "He doesn't know yet. He still thinks—" He trailed off. "That I'm a broke loser?" I finished for him. He had the decency to look ashamed. "Something like that." I considered his request. Part of me wanted to savor the moment, to reject him the way I'd been rejected. But another part saw an opportunity. "I won't consult on Henderson," I said finally. "The concept is fundamentally flawed, but I have a counterproposal." I outlined a new vision, one that would preserve the historic neighborhood while still allowing for development that would benefit both the community and Wyatt Development Group. Mixed-income housing, green spaces, community centers, and still plenty of profit potential. Ethan listened, skeptical at first, then increasingly engaged. By the time I finished, he was taking notes. "This could work," he admitted. "But Dad will never go for it. He doesn't believe in mixing luxury and affordable housing." "Then maybe it's time to show him the numbers," I said. "My Portland project returned 22% to investors in the first year alone. How's Henderson looking?" He winced. "We're hemorrhaging money on legal fees and delays." We spent the rest of the afternoon hammering out details. When Ethan left, he promised to present the new plan to our father, though we both knew it would be an uphill battle. A week later, I received an unexpected call from my mother. "Your father is having his annual 4th of July barbecue this weekend," she said. "He wants you to come." "Mom, I haven't been invited to that in years." "Well, you're invited now," she said firmly. Ethan insisted. I knew what this was. My father wanted to see me on his territory, where he could control the narrative. The barbecue was always a power display, his sprawling estate filled with business associates, politicians, and other influential figures. A celebration of Wyatt's success. Against my better judgment, I agreed to attend. The day of the barbecue was sweltering, the kind of heat that shimmers above asphalt. I parked my car, a modest hybrid, not the luxury vehicle my father would expect, and walked up the long driveway to my childhood home. The grounds were immaculate as always, with staff bustling about serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres to guests in summer finery. I spotted my father holding court near the pool, surrounded by men in polo shirts and women in expensive sundresses. Ethan stood at his side, playing his usual role of heir apparent. My mother fluttered among the guests, the perfect hostess in her designer dress and perfect makeup. Taking a deep breath, I approached the group. My father saw me coming and his smile faltered slightly before recovering. "Olivia," he said, with forced joviality. "What a surprise." You invited me, Dad, I reminded him. Of course, of course. He turned to his associates. My daughter, the idealist. She's working on some housing projects in Portland. The dismissive tone was familiar, but this time it didn't sting as much. I smiled politely and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. Throughout the afternoon, I mingled with guests, many of whom seemed genuinely interested in my work once they realized who I was. The Wyatt who's revolutionizing affordable housing, one city councilwoman called me. I noticed my father watching these interactions from a distance, his expression unreadable. It was later, as the sun began to set and the gathering moved to the expansive patio for dinner, that everything changed. I'd set my bag down beside my chair and was reaching for my phone when my wallet fell out, landing open on the stone pavers. A folded bank statement slipped out, the quarterly summary Thomas's financial team had prepared for me, detailing my equity in our various projects and personal investments. My brother, sitting across from me, reached down to help collect my things. His eyes widened as he caught sight of the statement. The bold number at the bottom, my total net worth, was impossible to miss. Olivia, he said, his voice strangled. Is this real? My father, always alert to any change in tone, looked over. What's real? Before I could stop him, Ethan handed the statement to our father. This can't be right, he said. My father put on his reading glasses and scanned the document. I watched his face transform, confusion, disbelief, then something close to shock. $80 million? He said, loud enough that conversations around us stopped. This has to be a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was the accumulated value of my equity in a dozen successful projects, plus wise investments guided by Thomas's financial team. I hadn't been paying much attention to the total. I was too busy doing the work I loved, but the number had been growing steadily. It's not a mistake, I said quietly, taking back the statement and returning it to my wallet. Just the result of a few years of being a broke loser. The silence around the table was deafening. My father's face had turned an unusual shade of red, not from anger, but from something I'd never seen there before, embarrassment. He was fumbling for words, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water. My mother's champagne glass was frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with disbelief. 80 million, my father repeated, as if saying it again might make it more comprehensible. How is this possible? All eyes at the table were on me now. Neighbors, business associates, local politicians, people who had known me since childhood, who had heard my father's dismissive comments about my career choices for years, were suddenly looking at me with newfound interest. I took a sip of my water, using the moment to decide how to respond. I could humiliate him the way he had humiliated me countless times. I could detail every dismissive comment, every missed milestone, every time he'd chosen Ethan over me. But looking at him now, I realized something important. I didn't need his approval anymore. I hadn't for a long time. Good investments, hard work, and purpose, I said simply. It turns out doing good can be profitable. My father cleared his throat. Well, I always knew you had potential, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The Wyatt business sense, obviously. Ethan snorted into his drink, earning a sharp look from our father. Actually, I continued, my voice steady, I learned more about what not to do from Wyatt Development than what to do. I looked directly at my father. You taught me that profit without purpose is hollow. So I found both. The awkward silence was broken by Thomas Laurent, who had been sitting quietly at the other end of the table, observing. I hadn't even realized my father had invited him. Your daughter is being modest, Mr. Wyatt, Thomas said, his calm voice carrying easily. What she's accomplished in 3 years is nothing short of revolutionary. Her Portland model has changed how we think about affordable housing. That's why I invested in her vision. My father's head snapped toward Thomas. You're her investor? The pieces were clearly falling into place in his mind. Thomas Laurent wasn't just any investor. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, known for his shrewd business sense and selective investments. Partner, Thomas corrected. Olivia doesn't need investors. She needs allies who share her vision. He raised his glass in my direction. To purpose and profit, the true Wyatt legacy, it seems. Several guests raised their glasses, murmuring agreement. My father had no choice but to join the toast, his expression caught between pride and confusion. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People who had barely acknowledged me in previous years suddenly wanted to talk about my projects, my approach, my vision for the future. Business cards were pressed into my hands. Invitations to speak at events were extended. I noticed my father watching these interactions from a distance, his expression unreadable. It was later, as the sun began to set and the gathering moved to the expansive patio for dinner, that everything changed. I'd set my bag down beside my chair and was reaching for my phone when my wallet fell out, landing open on the stone pavers. A folded bank statement slipped out, the quarterly summary Thomas's financial team had prepared for me, detailing my equity in our various projects and personal investments. My brother, sitting across from me, reached down to help collect my things. His eyes widened as he caught sight of the statement. The bold number at the bottom, my total net worth, was impossible to miss. Olivia, he said, his voice strangled. Is this real? My father, always alert to any change in tone, looked over. What's real? Before I could stop him, Ethan handed the statement to our father. This can't be right, he said. My father put on his reading glasses and scanned the document. I watched his face transform. Confusion, disbelief, then something close to shock. $80 million? He said, loud enough that conversations around us stopped. This has to be a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was the accumulated value of my equity in a dozen successful projects, plus wise investments guided by Thomas's financial team. I hadn't been paying much attention to the total. I was too busy doing the work I loved, but the number had been growing steadily. It's not a mistake, I said quietly, taking back the statement and returning it to my wallet. Just the result of a few years of being a broke loser. The silence around the table was deafening. My father's face had turned an unusual shade of red, not from anger, but from something I'd never seen there before, embarrassment. He was fumbling for words, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water. My mother's champagne glass was frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with disbelief. 80 million, my father repeated, as if saying it again might make it more comprehensible. How is this possible? All eyes at the table were on me now. Neighbors, business associates, local politicians, people who had known me since childhood, who had heard my father's dismissive comments about my career choices for years, were suddenly looking at me with newfound interest. I took a sip of my water, using the moment to decide how to respond. I could humiliate him the way he had humiliated me countless times. I could detail every dismissive comment, every missed milestone, every time he'd chosen Ethan over me. But looking at him now, I realized something important. I didn't need his approval anymore. I hadn't for a long time. Good investments, hard work, and purpose. I said simply, it turns out doing good can be profitable. My father cleared his throat. Well, I always knew you had potential, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The Wyatt business sense, obviously. Ethan snorted into his drink, earning a sharp look from our father. Actually, I continued, my voice steady, I learned more about what not to do from Wyatt development than what to do. I looked directly at my father. You taught me that profit without purpose is hollow. So I found both. The awkward silence was broken by Thomas Laurent, who had been sitting quietly at the other end of the table, observing. I hadn't even realized my father had invited him. Your daughter is being modest, Mr. Wyatt, Thomas said, his calm voice carrying easily. What she's accomplished in 3 years is nothing short of revolutionary. Her Portland model has changed how we think about affordable housing. That's why I invested in her vision. My father's head snapped toward Thomas. You're her investor? The pieces were clearly falling into place in his mind. Thomas Laurent wasn't just any investor. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, known for his shrewd business sense and selective investments. Partner, Thomas corrected. Olivia doesn't need investors. She needs allies who share her vision. He raised his glass in my direction. To purpose and profit, the true Wyatt legacy, it seems. Several guests raised their glasses, murmuring agreement. My father had no choice but to join the toast, his expression caught between pride and confusion. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People who had barely acknowledged me in previous years suddenly wanted to talk about my projects, my approach, my vision for the future. Business cards were pressed into my hands. Invitations to speak at events were extended. Through it all, I noticed my father watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. Ethan hovered nearby, looking like he didn't quite know which world he belonged in anymore, the old Wyatt empire or this new paradigm his sister had somehow created. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, my father finally approached me, where I stood talking with Thomas near the garden. "I'd like a word," he said stiffly. "In private." Thomas nodded respectfully and excused himself. I followed my father to his study, that imposing room with dark wood paneling and leather-bound books where he'd lectured me so many times before. He closed the door behind us and moved to pour himself a scotch from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. "Drink?" he offered, not looking at me. "No, thank you." He took a long sip before turning to face me. "Why didn't you tell us? Would you have believed me?" I asked. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Your brother showed me your proposal for Henderson," he said, changing the subject. "It's interesting." "It's viable," I corrected. "And it solves your community relations problem. It's not how we do things." "Maybe it should be," I suggested. "The world is changing, Dad. Development that ignores community needs and environmental impact isn't just wrong, it's becoming bad business." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, considering my words. "You really believe that mixed-income approach can be profitable?" "I don't believe it. I've proven it. 5 times over." He nodded slowly. "Ethan seems convinced." "Ethan is smart," I acknowledged. "He sees where the industry is heading." My father set his glass down and looked at me directly for what felt like the first time in years. "I was wrong about you," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "I didn't understand what you were building." It wasn't an apology. Richard Wyatt didn't apologize, but it was as close as he would ever come to one. I felt a complicated mix of emotions: vindication, sadness for all the wasted years, and a surprising hint of hope. "It's not too late to understand now," I said quietly. "Before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to believe in you most?" This is my story, and I promise it doesn't end how anyone expected. The next morning, I woke early in my old bedroom. I hadn't planned to stay the night, but the party had run late, and my mother had insisted. "Your room is always ready for you," she'd said, though we both knew it wasn't really my room anymore. The space had been redecorated years ago, all traces of my teenage self erased and replaced with neutral guest room decor. I dressed quickly and headed downstairs, hoping to slip out before anyone woke. But my brother was already in the kitchen, sitting at the island counter with a cup of coffee and his laptop open. "Morning," he said, looking up. "There's coffee in the pot." I poured myself a cup and leaned against the counter, unsure what to say. Our relationship had always been complicated. Not quite rivalry, not quite friendship. Ethan had been content to follow our father's path, to accept the advantages and expectations that came with being the Wyatt heir. I had questioned everything, challenged everything, and ultimately walked away. "That bank statement," he said finally, "that really threw Dad for a loop." I shrugged. I didn't plan for him to see it. "But you're not sorry he did?" "No," I admitted, "I'm not." Ethan closed his laptop and looked at me directly. "All these years, he told us you were struggling. That your idealistic projects were just hobby work. He made it sound like you were barely getting by." "And you believed him," I said, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. He nodded. "I did. We all did." He paused. But that's not why I came to you about Henderson. I genuinely think your approach is better. I studied my brother's face, looking for the competitive edge I'd grown up with, the smug superiority. Instead, I saw something new, respect, maybe even admiration. I meant what I said in my proposal. I told him, Wyatt Development could lead the industry in sustainable, community-integrated projects. You have the resources and connections to make it happen on a scale I'm still working toward. We, Ethan corrected, we have the resources. You're a Wyatt too, Liv. Always have been. The simple acknowledgement hit me harder than I expected. For so long I'd felt like an outsider in my own family, the odd piece that didn't quite fit. Now, with my success too substantial to dismiss, they were suddenly claiming me again. Dad wants to meet, Ethan continued, properly, at the office, to discuss a potential partnership. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sipped my coffee, considering the proposal. Part of me wanted to refuse, to protect the company I'd built from my father's controlling influence. But another part recognized the opportunity for real change. Not just in my family dynamics, but in how development could be done at the Wyatt scale. I'll think about it, I said finally. I left before my parents came downstairs, promising Ethan I'd call later in the week. As I drove back to my hotel, my phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Breakfast? We should talk about what just happened. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. Thomas was already there when I arrived, casually dressed in jeans and a light sweater, looking more like a college professor than one of the country's wealthiest venture capitalists. Your family is exactly as you described them, he said as I sat down, particularly your father. I smiled wryly. He was actually on his best behavior last night. He wants something from you now, Thomas observed. The question is, what do you want? It was the perfect Thomas question, direct, perceptive, and focused on the heart of the matter. In the 3 years we'd worked together, I'd come to value his clarity almost as much as his financial backing. Ethan mentioned a partnership, I said, bringing my approach to Wyatt Development. And what does your gut tell you? I considered the question carefully. That it could be transformative for the company and the communities they build in, but also that my father will try to control everything and take credit for the vision. Thomas nodded. Both things can be true. The question is whether the potential impact outweighs the personal cost. What would you do? I asked. He smiled. I'd ensure the terms were very clear and very public. Your father respects nothing more than leverage. Right now, you have it. Over the next week, I immersed myself in research, reviewing Wyatt Development's current projects, financial standing, and corporate structure. If I was going to consider a partnership, I needed to understand exactly what I'd be getting into. What I found was both concerning and promising. The company was financially solid, but facing increasing resistance to its developments, community protests, environmental challenges, zoning fights. My father's old-school approach of bulldozing opposition with money and political connections was becoming less effective in an era of social media activism and environmental awareness. Meanwhile, my own company was thriving but constrained by scale. We could do remarkable work in specific communities, but expanding nationally required resources we were still building. A strategic partnership could accelerate our impact dramatically. By the time I walked into Wyatt Development headquarters for the meeting with my father, I had a clear vision of what I wanted and what I wouldn't compromise on. The corporate offices hadn't changed much since I'd last visited years ago. Still the same imposing marble lobby, the same larger-than-life portrait of my father in the reception area, the same hushed atmosphere of wealth and power, but this time, heads turned as I walked through. Word had clearly spread about the prodigal daughter's return and her unexpected success. My father's executive assistant Marion, who had known me since I was a child, greeted me with wide eyes and a warm hug. Olivia, it's wonderful to see you. They're waiting in the main conference room. They turned out to be not just my father and Ethan, but the entire executive team, 12 men and 2 women in impeccable business attire, all looking at me with curious expressions as I entered. My father stood at the head of the long table, Olivia, thank you for coming. We thought it would be valuable for the whole leadership team to hear your perspective. I understood the play immediately. He was positioning me as an outside consultant, not a potential partner, keeping me firmly in the role of supplicant rather than equal. I smiled and set my briefcase on the table. Thank you for the invitation. Before we begin, I should mention that Thomas Laurent sends his regards. He was very interested to hear about this meeting. The subtle name drop had its intended effect. Several executives exchanged glances, and my father's expression tightened briefly before he recovered. Let's get started, he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. Actually, I said, remaining standing, I've prepared a presentation, if that's all right. Without waiting for his response, I connected my laptop to the room's display system. The screen lit up with the logo I'd designed for my company, a stylized tree with roots that formed the shape of a house. Below it were the words, Wyatt Community Development, building homes, growing communities. As you all know, I began, the development landscape is changing rapidly. Communities are demanding more say in how their neighborhoods evolve. Environmental considerations are becoming central, not peripheral. And a new generation of homebuyers is prioritizing sustainability and community integration over square footage and exclusivity. For the next 30 minutes, I outlined my vision, not just for the Henderson project, but for a fundamental shift in how Wyatt Development approached its business. I presented case studies from my own projects, showing the financial returns alongside the community impact metrics. I detailed the regulatory advantages of our approach, the reduced legal challenges, the positive press coverage, and the long-term value creation. Throughout my presentation, I watched the faces around the table. Some executives looked skeptical, others intrigued. Ethan was nodding along, occasionally adding supportive comments. My father remained impassive, giving nothing away. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, then a barrage of questions, some challenging, some genuinely curious. I answered each one directly, backing my responses with data from our completed projects. Finally, my father spoke. This is certainly a different approach than what we've traditionally done. He looked around the table. Thoughts? The CFO, a sharp-minded woman named Vanessa who I'd always respected, spoke first. The numbers are compelling. Lower upfront costs, faster approvals, better community reception, and the long-term value metrics are impressive. It's a complete departure from our brand, countered Marcus, the head of marketing. Wyatt Developments are known for exclusivity and luxury. Brands evolve, I responded. The question is whether you want to lead that evolution or be forced into it later. The discussion continued for another hour, with various executives weighing in. Throughout it all, my father observed more than he spoke, which was unusual for him. Finally, he stood up. I think we've given everyone plenty to consider, he said. Olivia, thank you for your presentation. The executive team will discuss further and get back to you. It was a dismissal, but a polite one. As the room began to clear, Ethan caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod of approval. My father remained at the table, reviewing his notes. I packed up my laptop and was about to leave when my father spoke again. That was impressive, he said, not looking up. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this. I've put my whole career into it, I corrected gently. He nodded, finally meeting my eyes. Ethan tells me you won't consider just consulting on Henderson, that it's a full partnership or nothing. That's right, I confirmed. What I'm proposing isn't a one-off project. It's a fundamental shift in approach. And if we're not ready for that shift, then I wish you well, I said simply. My company will continue on its path. There's plenty of room in the market for different approaches. He studied me with new eyes, not as his disappointing daughter, but as a business equal. It was a strange feeling, both satisfying and sad, to realize that my success in his own field had earned me a respect that my character alone never could. Let me think about it, he said finally. I nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. Dad, the offer has an expiration date, 2 weeks. After that, we're moving forward with our expansion plans in other directions. His eyebrows rose slightly at my directness. Understood. As I walked out of Wyatt Development headquarters, I felt lighter somehow. For the first time, I'd engaged with my father on my own terms, not his. Whether he accepted my proposal or not, something fundamental had shifted between us. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. A text from Thomas. "How did it go?" I smiled as I typed my response. Either I just changed Wyatt Development forever, or I finally closed that chapter completely. Either way, I won. The next morning, my phone rang early. It was Ethan. "Dad's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow," he said without preamble. "He wants you there." Did he say why? No, but he's been holed up in his office since your presentation, reviewing all our active projects and financial projections. And he asked for more details on your Portland model. "Interesting," I said, trying not to get my hopes up. "I'll be there." The board meeting was held in the company's most formal setting, a wood-paneled boardroom on the top floor with views overlooking the city. The space was designed to intimidate, with its oversized table and high-backed leather chairs. Portraits of past company leaders, all men, all wearing similar stern expressions, lined the walls. Board members filed in, mostly older men who had been my father's allies for decades, with a few younger faces mixed in. I recognized some from industry events, but had never met most of them personally. They regarded me with curious glances as I took the seat Ethan had saved for me near the middle of the table. My father entered last, carrying a thick folder. He took his place at the head of the table and called the meeting to order without any pleasantries. "You all have copies of the agenda," he began. "But before we address those items, there's something more pressing we need to discuss." He opened his folder. The future of Wyatt Development. For the next 20 minutes, my father did something I'd never seen him do before. He acknowledged failure. Not in those exact words, of course. Richard Wyatt would never use the word failure. But he methodically outlined the challenges facing the company: increasing community resistance, environmental regulatory hurdles, changing market preferences, and negative press coverage. "Our traditional approach has served us well for decades," he said, "but the landscape is changing faster than we are. We're facing longer development timelines, higher costs for legal challenges, and increasing difficulty securing prime locations due to community opposition." The board members shifted uncomfortably. These were issues they were aware of, but had been reluctant to address directly. "Yesterday," my father continued, "we were presented with an alternative vision." He looked directly at me. "One that addresses these challenges while maintaining profitability. Olivia, would you summarize your proposal for the board?" I was taken aback by the direct invitation but recovered quickly. I outlined my approach again, this time tailoring it specifically to the concerns my father had just raised. When I finished, my father did something even more unexpected. He stood up and walked to a large screen at the end of the room. "I've taken the liberty of running some projections based on Olivia's model applied to our current project pipeline." The screen displayed a series of graphs and financial projections, comparing the company's current trajectory with what it might look like under the new approach. "As you can see," he continued, "while the per-unit profit margin is somewhat lower initially, the overall financial performance improves significantly due to faster approvals, reduced legal expenses, and the ability to develop sites we've previously had to abandon due to community opposition." The room was silent as the board members studied the projections. Finally, one of the older members spoke up. "This is a significant departure from how we've operated for 40 years, Richard. Are you actually recommending this?" My father looked at me, then back at the board. "I'm recommending that we evolve, that we recognize the changing reality of our industry before it forces our hand." He paused. "And I'm proposing that the best way to do that is through a formal partnership with Wyatt Community Development, with Olivia leading the transition as our new Chief Innovation Officer." I couldn't hide my surprise. This was more than I'd hoped for, not just acceptance of my proposal but a formal role within the company hierarchy. "There would be conditions, of course," my father added, looking at me. "Your company would maintain its independence, but we would have first rights to implement your approaches in our developments. You would join our executive leadership team while continuing to run your own operation." The discussion that followed was intense. Some board members were enthusiastic about the new direction, others skeptical. Questions were raised about brand dilution, market perception, and implementation challenges. Throughout it all, my father advocated for the change with the same forceful conviction he'd once used to dismiss my ideas. It was surreal to hear him quoting statistics from my presentation, defending concepts he'd previously ridiculed. After nearly 2 hours of debate, the board voted to approve the partnership in principle, pending final contract negotiations. As the meeting adjourned, board members approached to introduce themselves, several expressing interest in visiting my Portland project. When the boardroom finally emptied, only my father, Ethan, and I remained. The tension that had defined our family dynamics for years hung in the air, transformed but not entirely gone. My father gathered his papers, movements precise and methodical as always. He'd just advocated for my vision in front of his most trusted advisors, something I never thought I'd witness, yet he seemed unable to look directly at me now. Ethan broke the silence. That went better than expected. My father nodded, still focused on organizing his notes. The board sees the value. That's what matters. I studied him, this man who had shaped so much of my life with his approval and disapproval. "Why did you do it?" I asked quietly. "You could have taken my ideas and implemented them yourself. You didn't need to bring me in." He finally looked up, his expression complicated. "Because they're not just ideas. They're a vision." He paused. "Your vision. And it works because you believe in it." Another pause. The company needs that conviction. It wasn't quite an admission that he was wrong all these years. It wasn't quite an apology. But coming from Richard Wyatt, it was monumental. "Besides," he added, a hint of his usual pragmatism returning, "your connection to Laurent's investment group doesn't hurt." Ethan laughed. "There it is. The real reason." But I could see it wasn't the only reason. My father had recognized something valuable and had chosen the success of his company over his pride. For him, that was perhaps the greatest concession possible. "The legal team will draft partnership terms," my father continued, back to business. "I'd like this formalized within the month." I nodded. "I'll have my lawyers review everything." "Your lawyers?" he repeated, with what almost looked like pride. "Of course." As we walked out together, father, son, and daughter, the weight of years of misunderstanding began to lift. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to feel the change. Outside the building, as we prepared to go our separate ways, my father hesitated, then extended his hand to me. "Welcome to Wyatt Development, Olivia." I took his hand, but then did something that surprised us both. I stepped forward and hugged him briefly. "It's good to finally be here," I said. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, legal discussions, and planning sessions. The partnership agreement took shape, carefully balancing autonomy for my company with integration into Wyatt Development's operations. Thomas was instrumental in the negotiations, ensuring that my vision wouldn't be diluted and that the social impact components remained central, not optional. Meanwhile, word of the partnership spread through industry circles. The press coverage was extensive, with headlines like "Wyatt Heir Revolutionizes Family Empire" and "The Future of Ethical Development, How Olivia Wyatt is Changing the Game." Business magazines wanted profiles. Sustainability conferences invited me to speak. Universities asked me to guest lecture on ethical business practices. Through it all, I maintained my focus on the work itself. The Henderson Project became our first test case, completely redesigned according to my community-integrated approach. What had been planned as an exclusive gated community became a mixed-income neighborhood with green spaces, community centers, and sustainable design elements. My father, to his credit, embraced the change publicly. He spoke at press conferences about the company's evolution toward community-centered development, as if it had been his idea all along. In private moments, he still questioned some aspects, still pushed back on others, but there was a new respect underlying our disagreements. Ethan adapted most easily to the new direction. Free from the burden of being the sole heir to the Wyatt legacy, he found his own niche in the company's transformation, focusing on innovative financing structures that made our mixed-income developments possible. One morning, about 3 months into the partnership, I arrived at my office to find a small package on my desk. No note, just a box wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was an old pearl hairpin, inexpensive but elegant, and a newspaper clipping from 20 years earlier. The small article, yellowed with age, described a community garden project led by elementary school students. In the grainy photo, I recognized my 10-year-old self, proudly showing off the tomatoes we'd grown. I knew immediately who it was from. My mother had always kept scrapbooks of family achievements, though they had primarily featured Ethan's accomplishments. Finding this clipping meant she had saved my moments too, even if they'd never made it into the family narrative. That evening, I visited my parents, home for dinner, a new monthly tradition we'd established since the partnership began. As my mother bustled around the kitchen, I approached her quietly and showed her the hairpin and clipping. "Thank you," I said simply. She didn't pretend not to understand. "I always knew you were special, Olivia," she said softly. "Just in a way your father and I didn't know how to support. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement of what had been lost and what might still be rebuilt." The real test of our new approach came 6 months into the partnership, when we held the community open house for the Henderson project. The site, once slated for bulldozing, had been thoughtfully integrated with the existing neighborhood. Historic buildings had been preserved and repurposed. New construction was designed to complement, not overwhelm, the area's character. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Community members who had once protested against Wyatt development now walked through the model homes and garden spaces with cautious optimism. Local officials who had delayed permits for months now posed for photos with my father at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. "This is remarkable," said Councilwoman Rivera, who had been one of the project's fiercest opponents. "I've never seen a developer actually listen to community input like this." "That's our new approach," my father replied smoothly, putting an arm around my shoulders. "Led by our Chief Innovation Officer here." The councilwoman smiled knowingly. "Yes, I've read about your daughter's influence. Quite the transformation." Later, as we watched people explore the community garden, designed with input from local schools, my father turned to me. "You were right," he said quietly. "About all of it." I looked at him in surprise. Richard Wyatt rarely admitted being wrong about anything. "The project will still be profitable," he continued. "Perhaps not as immediately lucrative as our traditional approach, but the goodwill we've created." He gestured to the families exploring the space, the positive media coverage, the city officials now eager to work with us. "That has value too, value I hadn't calculated properly." It was as close to a full acknowledgement as I would ever get, and I accepted it for what it was. "It's just the beginning," I told him. "Wait until you see what's possible when we apply these principles at scale." The success of the Henderson project opened doors across the country. Cities that had previously fought against Wyatt developments now courted us. Community groups that had organized protests now requested consultations. Our waitlist of potential projects grew longer each month. As our approach gained traction, other developers began to take notice. Some dismissed it as a passing trend or a publicity stunt. Others tried to imitate the surface elements without embracing the core philosophy. A few reached out sincerely, wanting to learn. 1 year into our partnership, we hosted an industry symposium on the future of community-centered development. Developers, architects, city planners, and community advocates from across the country gathered to discuss how the built environment could better serve the people who lived in it. My father gave the opening address, something I'd insisted on despite his reluctance. "For 40 years, he began, looking out at the packed auditorium, "I built what I thought people wanted. Exclusive communities, luxury amenities, prestige addresses." He paused. I was wrong. A murmur ran through the crowd. Richard Wyatt admitting a mistake was unprecedented. "Or rather," he continued, "I was incomplete in my understanding. I built for a segment of the market and ignored the whole. I prioritized short-term profits over long-term value creation. And I mistook exclusivity for quality." He gestured toward me, sitting in the front row. "It took my daughter showing me a different way to realize what we'd been missing. Not just as a company, but as an industry. The speech made headlines in business publications. Wyatt patriarch embraces daughter's vision, and old guard admits need for change. Industry giant pivots toward sustainability. But the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the accolades that followed. It was in the communities we were building, places where people of different income levels lived side by side, where green spaces flourished, where neighbors knew each other's names. It was in the letters we received from residents. The single mother who could finally afford to live in a safe neighborhood with good schools, the elderly couple who found community after years of isolation, the young family who could walk to work instead of commuting hours each day. And it was in the quiet moments with my father, as we walked through construction sites together, when he would ask questions about design choices or community feedback with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. One evening, after a particularly successful project launch in Chicago, we sat in the hotel bar, just the two of us. Ethan had flown home earlier, and my mother had never been one for business trips. "Did I ever tell you about my father?" my dad asked suddenly, swirling the ice in his scotch. "Grandpa William," I said, surprised. My grandfather had died when I was very young, and my father rarely spoke of him. "Not really." "He was a difficult man," my father said, his voice distant. "Built a small construction company from nothing. Worked 16-hour days. Expected the same from me." I listened, realizing I was hearing something few people ever had, Richard Wyatt reflecting on his own formation. He had one measure of success: profit. Everything else was secondary. My father took a sip of his drink. "When I took over, I followed the same playbook. It was the only one I knew." "And it worked," I acknowledged. "It did," he agreed, "until it didn't." He looked at me directly. "You found a better way. Not just more ethical or sustainable, though it is those things, but better business." That's what I didn't see at first. In that moment, I understood something about my father I'd never fully grasped before. His resistance to my path hadn't been just about control or tradition. It had been about fear. Fear that diverging from the only formula he knew might lead to failure. "We found a better way together," I corrected gently. "My approach on your scale." He nodded, accepting the olive branch. "Your brother is thriving with all this, you know." More than he ever did before. It was true. Ethan, freed from trying to be a carbon copy of our father, had discovered his own strengths in the company's new direction. He developed innovative financing models for mixed-income developments that were now being studied in business schools. "He was always brilliant," I said. "He just needed room to find his own path." "Like someone else I know," my father replied with the hint of a smile. As we sat there, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. From being the family disappointment to helping transform not just our company, but potentially an entire industry. From being dismissed as a naive idealist to being recognized as a visionary. The path hadn't been linear or easy. There had been moments of doubt, of frustration, of wanting to give up. But throughout it all, I'd stayed true to my conviction that profit and purpose could coexist, that, in fact, they strengthened each other. 2 years into our partnership, Thomas Laurent invited me to speak at the Global Impact Investment Summit in Geneva. It was the premier gathering of investors focused on both financial returns and positive social impact, a concept that had been fringe when I started my career but was now moving into the mainstream. My father insisted on attending, though such events had never been his scene. "I want to hear what you tell them," he said. "Besides, it's good for the Wyatt brand to be represented." The summit was held in a grand old hotel overlooking Lake Geneva, with ornate chandeliers and gilt-edged mirrors that had witnessed centuries of global gatherings. The audience was a mix of traditional investors curious about impact metrics, philanthropists exploring market-based solutions, and entrepreneurs like me trying to bridge both worlds. When my turn came to speak, I looked out at the sea of faces and saw my father in the third row, watching intently. Thomas sat beside him, the two men an unlikely pair, the traditional developer and the progressive tech billionaire, united in their support of my work. I come from a family of builders, I began. For generations, the Wyatt name has been associated with development, with changing skylines and creating new neighborhoods. But for most of that history, we built with a limited vision of what was possible and who we were building for. I shared the story of our transformation, not as a personal triumph, but as a case study in how traditional businesses could evolve to meet the challenges of a changing world. The choice between profit and purpose is a false dichotomy, I explained. The most sustainable businesses, in every sense of that word, are those that create value for all stakeholders. Investors, yes, but also communities, employees, and the environment. As I spoke, I could see heads nodding, hands taking notes. These were concepts that had once been dismissed as idealistic, but were now proving their worth in measurable results. The projects we've developed under our new model have shown consistent returns of 15 to 20% for investors, I continued, while also creating affordable housing, green spaces, and community amenities. They've reduced legal challenges by 85% and shortened approval timelines by more than half. I glanced at my father, who was listening with uncharacteristic humility. This approach requires us to rethink success, to measure it not just in quarterly profits, but in lasting value creation. It asks us to build not just for the market as it exists today, but for the communities we want to see in the future. After the presentation, as investors and developers crowded around with questions and business cards, I watched my father speaking with Thomas in a quiet corner. They seemed deep in conversation, two men from different worlds finding common ground. Later, as we walked along the lake shore in the crisp evening air, my father finally shared what they had discussed. "Laurent wants to create an investment fund," he said, "to scale your approach nationally. He's calling it the Community Catalyst Fund. That's been on his wish list for a while," I acknowledged. "But he's been waiting for the right moment. He thinks it's now," my father continued, "and he wants Wyatt Development as a founding partner." I stopped walking. "And what do you think?" My father looked out at the still waters of the lake, lights from the city reflecting on its surface. "I think it's time to leave a different kind of legacy." He turned to me. "Not just buildings, but a better way of building." 3 months later, we announced the Community Catalyst Fund, a $500 million investment vehicle dedicated to community-centered development across North America. My father and Thomas stood side by side at the press conference, the unexpected allies united by a shared vision of what development could become. Ethan led the structuring of the fund, creating innovative financing mechanisms that made the economics work for investors while preserving affordability for residents. I oversaw the project's selection criteria, ensuring that each development would uphold the principles we'd established. As reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, I found myself thinking of that family dinner 3 years earlier, the night my father had called me a broke loser and dismissed my career as worthless. How shocked they all would have been to see this moment. After the press conference, as we gathered in the company boardroom to celebrate, my mother approached me with an envelope. "This came for you," she said. "Hand delivered." Inside was an invitation, simple, elegant, to receive the Urban Visionary Award from the National Community Development Foundation. The organization I'd once begged to hire me was now honoring me for transforming the industry. "Congratulations," my mother said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We're so proud of you, Olivia." The word "we" hung in the air between us. For the first time in my adult life, it felt true. That night, as I drove home to my apartment, no longer the tiny studio I'd started in, but a comfortable loft in a mixed-income building my company had developed, I reflected on the winding path that had brought me here. I thought about that desperate young graduate, eating ramen noodles and applying for jobs no one would give her. About the courage it had taken to refuse my father's offer and forge my own path. About the countless nights of doubt and fear. If I could tell that younger version of myself anything, it would be this. Your worth isn't determined by others. Recognition. Your vision isn't validated by their approval. The path that feels lonely now may be the one that changes everything later. As I pulled into my parking space, my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Have you seen the stock price? Up 30% since the fund announcement. Turns out doing good is good business." Who knew? Besides you, obviously. Closing parentheses quote, I smiled and typed back. Tell Dad. He loves being right, even when he was initially wrong. My brother's response came quickly. Already did. He said, and I quote, Your sister usually is progress, right? Progress indeed. Not just for Wyatt development or for my relationship with my family, but for an industry that had long prioritized profit over people. Change was happening, rippling outward from our projects to influence others. And it had all started with a simple conviction that we could build better communities, better relationships, better futures. That what seemed like failure in one paradigm could become success in another. That sometimes the people who dismiss you most harshly are the ones who ultimately need your vision most desperately. As I looked up at my building with its community garden on the roof, its solar panels catching the last light of day, and its diverse residents coming home from work, I felt a deep satisfaction that no amount of money could provide. This was success. Not the bank statement that had shocked my family, though that validation had been sweetly satisfying. Not the awards or press coverage or industry recognition, though those opened doors for greater impact. No, success was creating spaces where people could thrive. Where families could afford to live with dignity. Where neighbors knew each other's names. Where profit and purpose weren't opposing forces, but partners in building a better world. My family had called me a broke loser, but I'd found a richness they'd never imagined and created wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars alone. And in the end, they hadn't just seen my bank statement. They'd seen a new way forward, and together we were building it, one community at a time. 5 years after the launch of the Community Catalyst Fund, I stood on the rooftop garden of our newest development in Denver, looking out at the mountains in the distance. What had once been an abandoned industrial site was now a thriving neighborhood. Affordable apartments integrated with market-rate housing, local businesses occupying ground floor spaces, community gardens and solar panels providing food and energy. Children played in the central courtyard below, their laughter rising up like music. Elderly residents sat on benches in the shade, watching the children and chatting with each other. A group of teenagers helped maintain the vegetable garden, learning about sustainable agriculture while earning credits toward rent. It's everything we envisioned, said Elena Mirova, now the director of our community engagement division. She'd been with me from the beginning, her belief in our approach unwavering, even when mine occasionally faltered. Better, actually, I replied. The community has really made it their own. That was the magic of our model. We didn't just build structures. We created frameworks that communities could fill with their own life and character. Every Catalyst project evolved differently, based on the needs and culture of its residents. Some emphasized arts and culture, others education or environmental sustainability. All fostered connection and belonging. Your father's downstairs, Elena mentioned, with the mayor. I nodded. I'll head down in a minute. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My father had changed in ways I never expected over these 5 years. The imperious developer who once measured success solely in dollars had become an unlikely advocate for our integrated approach. He still drove a hard bargain in negotiations, still insisted on financial discipline, but he'd developed a genuine appreciation for the human impact of our work. Today, he was meeting with city officials to discuss expanding our model to more neighborhoods across Denver. At 72, he showed no signs of slowing down, though he'd gradually ceded day-to-day operations to Ethan and me. I took one last look at the view, breathing in the sense of accomplishment, before heading downstairs to join the meeting. The elevator opened onto our community hub, a flexible space used for everything from children's programs to senior fitness classes to neighborhood meetings. Today it was set up for a presentation, with rows of chairs facing a screen displaying photos of the project's evolution. My father stood at the front, gesturing as he spoke with the mayor and several city council members. Ah, here she is, my father said as I approached. The real visionary behind all this. The mayor, a dynamic woman known for her commitment to equitable development, stepped forward to shake my hand. Ms. Wyatt, your work here is remarkable, We've been tracking the outcomes: reduced homelessness, improved health metrics, higher educational achievement among resident children. The City Council is unanimous in wanting to expand this model. That's wonderful to hear, I replied. We've found that when housing stability is addressed, so many other social challenges become more manageable. As the meeting proceeded, I found myself studying my father. His hair had gone completely white, and he'd lost some of the commanding physical presence that once intimidated boardrooms. But there was a different kind of strength in him now, a wisdom that came from allowing himself to be transformed by new ideas. He caught my eye during a pause in the presentation and gave me a small nod, our private acknowledgement of how far we'd come together. After the officials left, promising to fast-track approvals for our next 3 sites, my father and I walked through the development. Residents greeted us by name, another departure from the old Wyatt model, where developers rarely met the people who would live in their buildings. Maria's son got accepted to Colorado State. My father mentioned as we passed a ground-floor apartment where a woman watered plants on her small patio. Full scholarship. You know about that? I asked, surprised. He nodded. She told me last week when I was here for the community council meeting. Her family was in one of our first projects in Phoenix. Moved here when we opened this one. The fact that my father knew these details, that he attended community meetings and remembered residents' stories, still amazed me. 5 years ago, he wouldn't have known the names of anyone who lived in a Wyatt building unless they were high-profile clients. Remember when you said I'd be broke my whole life? I asked as we stopped at a small cafe that was part of our job training program. He winced slightly. I've said a lot of foolish things over the years. No, it's not about that, I assured him, accepting a coffee from the young barista who was learning the trade. I was just thinking that we've had to redefine what wealth really means. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He considered this as we sat at a small table near the window. The numbers are still important, he said, ever the businessman. The fund is outperforming market benchmarks. Investors are happy. True, I acknowledged. But that's not what I mean. I gestured toward the vibrant scene around us, the diverse residents going about their day, the small businesses thriving, the sense of community evident in every interaction. This is wealth too, I said. Social capital, human flourishing, the kind that doesn't show up on a balance sheet but makes all the difference in people's lives. My father was quiet for a moment. You know what Ethan said to me last week? He finally offered. He said he's prouder of what we've built in the last 5 years than everything that came before. I think I am too. Coming from Richard Wyatt, this was a profound admission. The empire he'd spent 4 decades building had been his identity, his life's achievement. To place greater value on these recent years spoke volumes about his evolution. We should get going, he said, checking his watch. Your mother's expecting us for dinner. Apparently she has news. My relationship with my mother had been slower to heal than the one with my father. Where he had been openly antagonistic, she had been passively dismissive, a subtler but no less painful rejection. Our reconciliation had come in small moments. Shared cups of tea, cautious conversations that gradually grew more honest. Her quiet pride as my work gained recognition. We arrived at my parents' home to find not just my mother waiting, but also Ethan and his wife Lisa, Thomas Laurent, and Elena. The dining room was set for a celebration, with flowers and candles and my mother's best china. What's going on? I asked, confused by the gathering. My mother smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression that had once been rare. We have something to share with you. As we settled around the table, Thomas and my father exchanged glances. My father nodded, deferring to Thomas to speak. The Catalyst Fund has officially reached its 5-year benchmarks. Thomas began. All targets met or exceeded, financial returns, housing units created, community impact metrics. I knew this already. We'd received the final report last week. What you don't know, Thomas continued, is that meeting these benchmarks triggers the expansion phase we built into the original agreement. He slid a folder across the table to me. Inside was a proposal for a $2 billion expansion of the fund, with backing from some of the largest institutional investors in the country. $2 billion? I whispered, stunned by the figure. That's right, my father confirmed. Enough to replicate our model in 50 more cities over the next decade. A national rollout. My mother reached for my hand. This is your legacy, Olivia. Transforming how communities are built across the country. I looked around the table at these people who had traveled this journey with me. Some from the beginning, others who had joined along the way. Each had contributed something essential to this vision. Our legacy, I corrected gently. I couldn't have done this alone. Later that evening, as everyone lingered over dessert and coffee, sharing stories and plans for the expansion, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from James Harrington, the dean of the business school, where I'd once been a struggling student with unconventional ideas. Saw the news about the Catalyst expansion, he wrote. The faculty has unanimously voted to establish the Olivia Wyatt Fellowship for Sustainable Development. Would you consider being the inaugural lecturer? Your journey from idealistic graduate to industry transformer is exactly the kind of story our students need to hear. I smiled at the irony. The same institution that had once tacitly endorsed my father's rigid approach to development now wanted me to teach students about the alternative path I'd forged. As I looked up from my phone, I caught sight of a photograph on my parents' mantle, one I'd never seen displayed before. It was me at my college graduation, proudly holding my diploma. My mother must have taken it before leaving early for my father's important client meeting. The fact that she'd kept it all these years, and now finally felt comfortable displaying it, spoke volumes about how far we'd all come. The evening wound down, with Ethan and Lisa the first to leave, citing the babysitter's curfew. Thomas and Elena followed shortly after, with plans to meet the next morning to begin mapping out the fund expansion. As I prepared to leave myself, my father walked me to the door. Before you go, he said, there's something else we didn't mention at dinner. He led me to his study, that imposing room where he'd once lectured me about the real world, and gestured for me to sit. From his desk drawer, he withdrew an envelope and handed it to me. What's this? I asked. Open it, he urged. Inside was a formal letter, announcing that Wyatt Development Group was changing its name to Wyatt Community Partners. Below was the company's new mission statement, emphasizing sustainable development, community integration, and social impact alongside financial returns. The board approved it unanimously, my father said, effective immediately. I looked up at him, understanding the significance of this change. For decades, the Wyatt name had been synonymous with luxury developments and exclusive communities. This rebrand represented a complete embrace of the vision I'd championed. Thank you, I said simply. He shook his head. No, Olivia, thank you, for not giving up, for showing us a better way. He paused, for forcing me to see beyond my own limited perspective. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the long, winding path that had brought me here, from being dismissed as a naive idealist to reshaping an entire company and potentially an industry, from feeling like an outsider in my own family to helping transform their legacy. The journey hadn't been smooth or straightforward. There had been moments of doubt, of frustration, of wanting to give up. Nights when I wondered if my father had been right all along. Days when the challenges seemed insurmountable. But through it all, I'd held on to my conviction that there was a better way to build, not just structures, but communities. That profit and purpose weren't opposing forces but complementary ones. That the greatest success came not from excluding others, but from lifting them up alongside you. The next morning, I woke early and drove to our very first project site, the small eco-village outside Portland that had started it all. Though we'd built much larger developments since, this one remained special to me. It was where we'd proven the model, where we'd shown that our approach could work in the real world. The community had matured beautifully over the years. Trees planted as saplings now provided shade along walkways. Gardens had flourished. The residents had formed a tight-knit community, supporting each other through life's challenges and celebrations. As I walked the familiar paths, I remembered the doubt and fear I'd felt when we broke ground here. The weight of having everything to prove. The knowledge that failure would validate every dismissive comment my father had ever made. Now, as I watched children heading to the community school and neighbors chatting in the shared courtyard, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just a successful development project, it was a thriving ecosystem of human connection. Maria Chen, one of the original residents who now served as community coordinator, spotted me and waved me over to the communal kitchen, where a group was preparing for a celebration. "Perfect timing," she exclaimed. "We're getting ready for the 5th anniversary party tomorrow. Will you say a few words?" "I'd be honored," I replied. "We've been collecting stories," she continued, gesturing to a colorful display board covered with photographs and handwritten notes. "Everyone's sharing what this place has meant to them." I browsed the stories. A single mother who'd found stable housing and support that allowed her to finish her degree. An elderly couple who'd found community after years of isolation. A young entrepreneur who'd started a business in one of our incubator spaces. One note in particular caught my eye. "Before moving here, I was just surviving. Now I'm thriving. Thank you for building more than just houses, for building a real home." That evening, I sat on the bench overlooking the central green, watching as residents gathered for an impromptu potluck dinner. Tables appeared, dishes were shared, children darted between groups of adults deep in conversation. Thomas Laurent found me there, taking a seat beside me, without disrupting my contemplation. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, observing the community in action. When we first met, he finally said, "You told me you wanted to change how communities were built." I thought it was a worthy goal, but honestly, I underestimated how profound that change could be. I smiled. So did I in some ways. "Your father called me yesterday," Thomas continued. "He wanted to talk about governance for the expanded fund. He suggested we create an advisory board of residents from our developments. People who actually live in these communities having a voice in how we grow." I turned to look at him, surprised. "That was his idea?" Thomas nodded. He said something that stuck with me. "We've been building for people for decades. Maybe it's time we start building with them." The transformation in my father continued to amaze me. From the man who once dismissed my ideas as naive idealism, to someone who now pushed the boundaries of inclusive development himself. We've all changed through this process, I reflected. That might be the most valuable outcome of all. The next day, at the community's 5th anniversary celebration, I found myself standing before residents, local officials, and team members who had helped make this vision a reality. As I looked out at their faces, I felt a surge of gratitude for the journey that had brought us all together. 5 years ago, I began, when we broke ground here, many people told us this approach wouldn't work, that affordable housing couldn't be beautiful, that diverse communities couldn't be cohesive, that sustainability and profitability couldn't coexist. I gestured to the thriving community around us. You have proved them wrong every day, not just by living here, but by transforming this place from a development into a true community. I shared briefly about the fund expansion, about how their success had created a blueprint that would now benefit communities across the country, how their story would help change the narrative about what housing could be. But the numbers and the scale, impressive as they are, aren't what matters most, I continued. What matters is what happens in the spaces between the buildings. The relationships formed over shared meals. The children who grow up with diverse role models. The elders who find purpose in mentoring younger generations. The everyday miracle of people caring for each other. As I concluded my remarks, I noticed my father standing at the back of the gathering. He hadn't mentioned he would be coming, but there he was, listening intently, nodding as I spoke. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment, I felt the full circle of our journey, from rejection to respect, from conflict to collaboration. After the formal program ended, and people dispersed to enjoy the festivities, he made his way to me through the crowd. "Impressive speech," he said, his gruff manner unable to conceal his pride, "though you left out the part about proving your old man wrong." I laughed. That was implied. He looked around at the community celebration in full swing, children playing games, music playing, people of all ages and backgrounds enjoying each other's company. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I spent decades measuring success by the profit margin on each project, by how exclusive our developments were, by how much we could charge for each square foot." He shook his head slightly. What a limited way to measure the value of what we build. I followed his gaze, taking in the vibrant scene before us. There are many kinds of wealth, I replied. The financial kind is just the easiest to count. Quote, Your brother wants to create an impact measurement tool, my father continued. Something that quantifies the social and environmental benefits alongside the financial returns. Says investors are demanding it now. He's right, I confirmed. The market is changing. More people want their investments to reflect their values. My father was quiet for a moment, then said something that touched me deeply. I'm glad I lived long enough to see this, to understand what you were trying to tell me all those years ago. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the celebration, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, from being called a broke loser by my own family to leading a movement that was transforming an industry. From eating ramen noodles in a tiny studio apartment to managing a multi-billion-dollar fund. But the true wealth wasn't in the bank balance that had so shocked my family years ago. It was in seeing this vision become reality. In watching communities thrive, in witnessing my own family transform alongside our business. Success wasn't proving my father wrong, it was helping him see a new possibility. It wasn't rejecting my family's legacy but expanding it to include a more inclusive, sustainable vision of development. As I looked out at this community, the first of many we'd created and many more to come, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey, challenges and all. For the rejection that had forced me to find my own path. For the struggle that had clarified my purpose. For the family that had eventually found their way back to me, transformed by the very vision they had once dismissed. They had called me a broke loser, but in losing their narrow definition of success, I had found something far more valuable, a way to build that honored both profit and purpose, that created wealth in its many forms, that left the world better than I found it. And in the end, that was the richest legacy of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.